In this video, we will be working through the process to create the drop leaf end table project. This project consists of 9 steps. Step number 1 is to create the sides. Step number 2 is to create the feet. Step number 3 is to create the lower lateral connector. Step number 4 is to create the leaf supports. Step number 5 is to create the top. Step number 6 is to create the cleat pieces. Step number 7 is the base assembly. Step number 8 is the leaf support installation. And step number 9 is final assembly. Our project plans consist of 8 sheets. The first sheet takes a look at our overall assembly. The second sheet takes a look at our side pieces. The third sheet takes a look at the foot pieces. The fourth sheet takes a look at our lower lateral connector. The fifth sheet takes a look at the leaf supports. Our sixth sheet takes a look at the top center. Our seventh sheet takes a look at the top leaf. And our final 8th sheet takes a look at the cleat pieces. On our project, we have 2 sides. If we take a look at the schematic of our side piece, we can see that the total width equals 8 inches and the total length equals 23.5 inches. To conserve lumber, we will be gluing up a large sides blank or a large board that we will be able to get both side pieces out of. Given that each side piece is a total width of 8 inches, if we glue up more than about 16.5 inches, this should give us plenty of material to have 2 8-inch pieces side by side and still leave us a little extra material to work with. I have selected 2 boards. The first board measures about 5.5 inches wide, and the second board measures about 6 inches wide. My length is 23.5, so I'm going to lay this out at 24 inches. On my first board, I can get 3 pieces that are 5.5 inches wide by 24 inches long. That will give me a total of 16.5 inches. However, I need to have extra material if I take into account that I will be joining and table sawing some of my material off to clean up the edges of these boards for the purpose of prepping them for glue. So if I add an additional piece from my second board, that will give me an additional 6 inches of material to work with, which will give me more than enough material to get my 2 side pieces out of. If I take a look at my first board that I will be cutting, I have one end that is fairly good. It is not square, but it looks fairly good. My other end, however, has a large crack. If I start by cutting off the entire cracked portion, I'm hoping that I have enough material left to get my 3 24-inch long pieces. Alternatively, I could take a little tiny bit of material off of the good end or the better end, and I know that I would have enough material to get me 3 pieces. And even if my third piece has a little bit of that crack on it, I can rip that off on the table saw at a later time, thus ensuring I have plenty of material to get my 3 24-inch pieces and reducing the amount of waste in the process. When we get to the miter saw, do not follow the chalk lines. The chalk lines mean nothing at this point. They are only used to ensure that we have enough material. So we're going to take off just a little tiny bit of material just to square up the end of this board. We're then going to measure our board to a length of 24 inches. Now again, the final measurement is 23.5. So this 24-inch measurement will give us an extra ½ inch of material to work with. And we will again measure 24 inches and cut our second piece. We'll then flip our board to make sure we have plenty of material to hang on to. On my 6-inch wide board, I'm going to begin by squaring up the end. Now we do have an area where there is a knot, and I want to try to remove a decent portion of that material. And on the other end of the board, we also have a knot and a big divot missing. So regardless of the end that we start with, we will be removing a fairly significant chunk of waste material. Measure that at 24 inches again, and our final cut. We now have 4 boards that are cut to an oversized measurement of 24 inches. If we put the boards together and measure the total width, we have 23 inches, which is more than our 16.5-inch measurement that we need to create our sides blank. So this will give us more than enough material to create both of those sides. Currently we have 4 boards. Each board has 1 rough edge and 1 straight lined edge. That is pretty good, but not great. We want to take our best edge, which is the straight lined edge, and clean that edge up on the joiner. Running each board through 1 or 2 times should be sufficient to clean up that edge. After joining that straight lined edge, I have 1 good, clean, jointed edge and 1 rough edge. Using the table saw with my good, clean, jointed edge up against the fence, I'm going to remove as little material as possible so I am left with the maximum amount of material to be able to glue up. I do, however, have one of my boards with a crack in it. My good, clean, jointed edge is the side that has the crack in it. I am still going to run the rough edge through the table saw and rip off the rough edge. I'm then going to joiner that milled edge and then come back and table saw off my cracked portion. This will ensure I am eliminating that cracked portion, but I am still getting the maximum amount of material possible out of this board. After taking off that rough edge, I am left with a mill-marked edge from the table saw. And of course I have my clean jointed edge. The next step is to clean up that milled edge by running each board through the joiner with that milled edge down. And what I am left with is 4 boards with good, clean, jointed edges on both of the edges. Taking a look at my 4 boards that will become my sides blank, I need to make sure that the face grain looks good and the end grain is set up properly. To help prevent my sides from twisting or cupping or bowing over the life of the project, I'm going to make sure that my end grain is alternating. Up, down, or down, up. Taking a look at my first board, I can see that my grain pattern is going in a downward direction. My second board is going up. My third board is also going up, as well as my fourth board. If I flip that one board, I am now alternating grain directions. Down, up, down, up. If I squeeze all of the boards together, there should not be any gaps where the boards meet. If there are gaps, that means there is an issue with the edge of the board and you might need to re-joint one of the edges or both of the edges. We also want to take a look at the aesthetics of the grain pattern. If I start on the end here, I can see that I have fairly tight grain on my first board, and my second board I have fairly wide grain. What I can do is flip my board, and so now I have wider grain that meets wider grain. And so this looks a little bit more natural and like it was originally one board. My middle boards here don't actually look too bad. I got kind of a medium width grain pattern. So that blends in pretty good. My end board here doesn't look too bad either. We got kind of some little bit of straighter grain almost, meeting up with a little bit of straighter grain also. So this is looking pretty good. And if necessary, you can mix and match the boards to go however you want so it looks aesthetically good. But you always want to come back and double check that end grain. So I flipped some boards around and I ended up with down, up, down. So I'm going to need to keep going and make sure that my end grain is alternating across my board and my face grain is looking good. And when we have that set up exactly how we want, we're going to number the joints so that when we transition to the glue area, we know how these boards were laid out. With 2 clamps spread apart, we're going to lay out our boards in the same order that we prepped them. We want to verify that those numbers are lined up so that we know our boards are lined up as well. We can then flip up each of our boards and apply glue to the edges. We want to make sure we spread the glue around and get good coverage across the entire edge of the board. Once glued, we can flip those boards down and snug our clamps. As we do this, we want to check the surface to make sure that it is fairly flush. It does not need to be perfect, but it should be pretty good. And we also want to check the ends to make sure that they are also fairly flush. And with just a little bit of pressure applied to both of those clamps, we'll put a third clamp on top and snug that one down as well. And then we can go back and snug up our first two clamps, alternating pressure, and make sure you are double checking all of your joints. We can then come back with wet paper towel and clean up all of our glue. And don't forget the bottom. After that, we need to let our sides blank sit for 24 hours. After our sides blank piece has been sitting for 24 hours, the glue has cured and we can remove the clamps and hang those back up. If there's any residual dried glue or glue underneath where the clamps were sitting, we want to use a glue scraper and scrape off as much as we can on both the front and the back. We also want to take a look at each of the glue joints to make sure there are no gaps and that it did in fact glue up correctly. We want to make sure that the surfaces are fairly flush and everything's looking pretty good with this piece. If I take a look at the schematic for my side piece, I can see that it has a total finished width of 8 inches for each side and a total length of 23.5 inches. The board that I glued up is 21.5 inches wide, which is more than enough material to get me 2 8-inch wide pieces out of. Now, since this board was just glued up, there were clamps touching the edge of the board. There is a good chance that my good, clean, jointed edge is now been marred by the clamps. So I'm going to run one edge through the joiner one time just to clean up that edge once again. Now, although my finished size is 8 inches wide, I am going to set the table saw fence to 8 1/16 inches. This will allow 1 extra 1/16 of an inch of material because this edge touching the saw blade will become mill marked by that saw blade. And after ripping that board, I have one piece that is 8 1/16 inches wide, and I have my remaining material, which is more than 8 inches wide. I also have one good, clean, jointed edge and one mill-marked edge for my first side piece. My remaining material, I have one mill-marked edge and a clamp marred edge. I'm going to take both of my mill-marked edges and clean those up on the joiner before I continue. With my remaining material and my good, clean, jointed edge up against the fence, I'm going to rip another 8 1/16 inch piece for my second side. And again, I am left with my 8 1/16 inch side and my extra material. On my side piece, I have one good, clean, jointed edge and one mill-marked edge from the table saw. On my off-cut piece, I have a mill-marked edge and a clamp marred edge. My off-cut piece I'm going to save for later because I might be able to use that for a different part of the project. With my side piece, I'm going to clean that up on the joiner and take off that mill-marked edge. And what we are left with are our two side pieces measuring a finished width of 8 inches. We have an oversized length of 24 inches and a thickness of 1 inch. Currently, our two side pieces measure an oversized length of 24 inches. If we take a look at the schematic, our finished length is 23.5 inches. Now, because we had previously glued these boards together, the ends of our boards are not clean or square. We need to take a little bit off on the miter saw just to square up one end of these boards. And I'm going to put a small mark on the end of the board that I just cut before I flip the boards. And measuring from my good cut end, the one that I just marked, I'm going to mark my board at 23.5 inches. I'm then going to line up that first board as if I were to cut it. But before I make that cut, I'm going to add a stop block and clamp that down. I'm then going to slide each of my pieces gently into that stop block, double checking that my good end, the one I made the mark on, is up against the stop block, and then make my cuts. My two side pieces are now exactly 8 inches wide by exactly 23.5 inches long. My ends are perfectly perpendicular to my edges. These sides are square. With my length and width measurements correct, I now need to adjust the thickness. If we take a look at the schematic, the thickness of our side pieces is 3/4 of an inch. With the thickness planer set properly, we're going to make our first pass through the planer. After each pass, we're going to check the thickness of the board. If we are above our 3/4 inch thick measurement, we'll close the mouth of the planer about a half a turn on this particular planer, flip the board, and run the other surface. And we'll continue with this procedure until we reach our 3/4 inch measurement. And when finished planing, our sides now measure a finished width of 8 inches, a finished length of 23.5 inches, and our finished thickness of 3/4 of an inch. If we take a look at the schematic for our side piece, we can see there are two drill hole locations. These two hole locations will have a fastener that connects to our lower lateral connector later on in the project. Based on the measurements from the schematic, I created a template that will fit on our side pieces. Before tracing the template, we want to make sure that the bottom edge is perfectly lined up with the bottom of our side piece. And we also want to double check the top edge that it is also lined up perfectly. After that, we can trace the outside shape as well as those drill hole locations. After having traced that onto the side pieces, you will notice that the bottom is 8 inches on the template. The middle, or about middle, is 8 inches from side to side, and the top is 8 inches. Additionally, those drill hole locations are directly down the center of each of these side pieces. Taking a look at the schematic of our side piece, we can see that there are 2 hole locations. If we take a closer look at what these holes look like, we have a larger hole, or a countersink hole, that has a diameter of 0.375 or 3/8 of an inch. So we have a diameter of 0.375, and that is a countersink with a flat bottom hole. We then have a diameter of 0.125 or 1/8 that goes all the way through our project. If we use a 3/8 inch Forstner bit, we are able to achieve a 3/8 inch diameter hole. We are also able to achieve a flat bottom countersink hole. Our schematic shows that our 3/8 inch diameter hole only goes halfway through our project, or 3/8 of an inch, because the sides of our project are 3/4 of an inch thick. Halfway through is 3/8 of an inch. If we take a look at that Forstner bit, the distance from the tip of the cutting area to the shoulder of the bit is about 3/8 of an inch. So if we drill to the shoulder and then stop, that should put us halfway through our project. Do not drill all the way through your project. And clamping your board to the table will ensure that it will not move while you're drilling. And remember, if you keep 2 hands on the drill, you can't drill through your hand. Now you will notice that little spike has created a small divot right in the center, which will help us with the next drilling process. With our larger 3/8 inch countersink hole drilled, and that spike having put that little divot, we can then come back with a 1/8 inch drill bit and drill all the way through the project. Now you want to make sure you position it over a vise so you do not drill through the tabletop. We have previously traced the outside shape of the side pieces. To cut these out, we are going to create some relief cuts on the bandsaw and then follow our lines, staying about 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch away from the lines. When we hit each of our relief cuts, that gives us an opportunity to reposition the piece and make sure we are staying away from the line. Later on, we're going to sand down to the line. Taking a look at our side pieces, we have both exterior curves and interior curves. For the interior curves, we will be using a spindle sander with a large diameter spindle. And for the exterior curves, we will be using a 1-inch belt sander. After spindle sanding and belt sanding both of our side pieces, they're looking pretty good. To finish sand the sides, we're first going to start with 80 grit sandpaper on a palm sander, and we're going to be sanding both faces of both side pieces. We'll then move to 120 grit, and then we'll move to a finer grit like 150 or 220, and we'll do one additional round of sanding. Now at this stage, the edges are pretty sharp. We're not going to sand the edges yet. We need to wait until after we have started assembling some of this together to bring those sharp edges down. So at this point, for the final sanding, we are only doing the faces. And once you are finished sanding, the side pieces are done for now. Taking a look at our project plan, each of the side pieces have a foot connected to the base of the side. If we take a look at the schematic for our foot, this measures a total length of 14 inches by a total width of 4 inches. I have a piece of reusable waste material that I cut off when I created my side pieces. I also found one additional board that is more than 4 inches by 14 inches. This should provide me with enough lumber to get both of these foot pieces out of and not have too much waste material that I won't be able to use somewhere else. If I take a look at my foot schematic, each piece measures a finished length of 14 inches. I want to give myself just a little bit extra material to work with, so I will be cutting my pieces to 14.5. On the miter saw, I want to start by squaring up one end by taking off as little as possible. I'm then going to measure to 14.5 inches and cut each of those pieces. And I'm left with two boards that measure 14.5 inches long by more than 4 inches wide. My 2 feet pieces are more than 4 inches wide. Taking a look at the schematic, my finished width needs to be exactly 4 inches wide. Now, since I pulled these boards out of a reusable waste material bin, I don't know how good the edges are, so I'm going to start by joining one edge on each of these boards, which will give me a good edge to put up against the fence on the table saw. Now, since my finished measurement is 4 inches, I'm going to rip my boards to 4 1/16, giving me that additional 1/16 inch to joint off after I table saw. And so I'm left with one good, clean, jointed edge and one mill-marked edge on each of the foot pieces. I'm going to joiner off the 1/16 inch on that mill-marked edge, and that should bring me down to my finished 4-inch width measurement. Lengthwise, I am at an oversized 14.5 inches. Widthwise, I am at my finished 4-inch measurement. And thickness, I am still at 1 inch. Taking a look at the schematic for our foot pieces, we have a finished thickness of 3/4 of an inch. Currently, my boards sit just under an inch thick. Following our planing procedure, we're going to set the planer, run our boards through one time, measure the boards. If we're over 3/4 of an inch, we'll bring the planer down, flip our boards and run them again, measure the boards. Again, if it is over 3/4 of an inch, bring the planer down, flip our boards, and continue this process until we get down to 3/4 of an inch. Once finished planing, my length is now 14.5 inches, which is oversized. My width is 4 inches, and my thickness is 3/4 of an inch. Taking a look at our entire project, we can see that the foot pieces are cut to a very specific shape to fit on the sides, and transferring these measurements over onto a template will speed things up. We want to make sure the bottom edge is perfectly flush before we trace our template. And after creating a few relief cuts, we can cut out our shape. And we're wanting to make sure that we stay 1/16 to an 1/8 inch away from the line so we can sand down to the line later. And using a disc sander or belt sander, we can sand down to the line. And with those edges cleaned up on the sander, we're looking pretty good. To complete our finish sanding process for our feet pieces, we're first going to begin with 80 grit sandpaper. We're going to be sanding both faces, the front and the back, of each foot piece. We're then going to come back with 120 grit sandpaper and follow that up with either 150 or 220 grit sandpaper. At this point, we are not going to sand the sharp edges, but we are going to see if we can get any little burn marks from the corners out. Starting with a piece of 80 grit and a little block of wood, we're going to see if we can take out some of those burn marks. That's looking a little bit better. We'll keep working on this for a while. Taking a look at our project plans, we can see that the lower lateral connector connects both of our sides together. This also holds the pivot point for our leaf supports. Looking at the schematic for our lower lateral connector, this part has a finished length of 18 inches and a finished width of 2.5 inches. I was able to find a piece of material in my reusable waste bin that measures 23.5 inches by about 3.5 inches. This should yield me plenty of material to be able to get my lower lateral connector piece. Currently, my material is 23.5 inches long. If I take a look at the schematic for our lower lateral connector, I can see that it has a finished length of 18 inches. Following our procedural order for squaring stock, I'm first going to cut this to an oversized measurement and give myself an extra 1/2 inch. And to begin this, I'm going to take a small amount off the end to square up that end. Flip that board and measure to 18.5 and make that cut. My material now measures my oversized 18.5 inches long by about 3.5 inches wide. Currently, my material is about 3.5 inches wide. If I take a look at the schematic, I want my finished width to be 2.5 inches. However, because I grabbed this board out of the reusable waste, I am unsure on the quality of the edges of the material. So I'm going to start by cleaning up one edge on the joiner, so I have a good edge to go up against the table saw fence. I will be setting the fence to 2 9/16, which is 1/16 inch over my finished measurement of 2.5 inches. This then leaves me with my good, clean, jointed edge and a mill-marked table-sawed edge. After running that mill-marked table-sawed edge through the joiner, I'm able to remove that 1/16 inch extra material, leaving me with a finished 2.5 inch wide by 18.5 inch long workpiece. If we take a look at the schematic for our lower lateral connector, we can see that this piece has a thickness of 3/4 of an inch. Currently, I'm sitting at about 15/16 of an inch on my material. Following our procedure for planing material by setting the planer, running the material through, measuring our board, adjusting the planer, flipping the material and running it through again, we can bring this piece down to 3/4 of an inch. And we now have our piece measuring a finished thickness of 3/4 of an inch, a finished width of 2.5 inches, and an oversized length of 18.5 inches. Taking a look at the schematic for our lower lateral connector, we can see that 18 inches is our finished length measurement. Given that the length measurement of our board is 18.5 inches, which is an oversized measurement, we need to bring this down to 18. We will start by squaring up one end and taking off as little material as possible. Flip our board and measure 18, and then complete our cut. And we are left with a finished workpiece measuring 18 inches long, 2.5 inches wide, and 3/4 inches thick. If we take a look at the schematic for our lower lateral connector, we can see that there are 2 holes located on one edge towards the center of this board. Additionally, these holes measure a depth of 3/4 of an inch. They also have a diameter of 3/8 of an inch. To set this up, we can place a 3/8 inch drill bit in our drill guide, and we can then use a ruler, and by using a ruler and moving that drill bit back and forth, we can determine the drill depth. We want this to be set at about 3/4 of an inch. And when correctly positioned, we can add a piece of tape. If we take a look back at the schematic, we can see that each of these holes are centered 8 1/4 from the ends of the board. And we can verify our measurements by measuring between the marks. This measurement should equal 1.5 inches. And our board can then be clamped in the vise. We can then install our drill guide and line up our identified hole location with the mark on the drill guide. And we can drill down to our tape mark. Slide that down to our next mark and drill another hole. And we now have our 2 holes drilled to a depth of 3/4 of an inch and a diameter of 3/8 of an inch, both being located 8 1/4 inches in from the end. If we take a look at the schematic for our lower lateral connector, we can see that there is 1 pilot hole in each end, this hole being a diameter of 1/8 of an inch. It is drilled to a depth of 1 1/4 inches, and it is positioned 3/8 of an inch from the faces inward towards the center and 3/8 of an inch downward from the top edge. Now we also want to note that this is nearest the edge that has the holes we previously drilled, those 3/8 inch larger holes. So you want to make sure when we lay this out that this pilot hole is nearest the edge that we had previously drilled on. Now I'm going to be installing this in the vise. I have the holes that I previously drilled. I'm going to be doing my pilot hole along that same edge. I will be measuring 3/8 of an inch from each edge and 3/8 of an inch down from the top. Using a scratch-awl or even just a screw, we're going to gently create a small divot right at that intersecting point. And then we can drill that to 1 1/4 inches depth. Now that little divot will help prevent the drill bit from walking or moving around on the end of the board. And we'll flip that board and complete the same procedure on the other end. Just make sure that we are still drilling on the edge of our larger holes. And with those pilot holes now drilled, we're looking pretty good. On our lower lateral connector, we're going to be finish sanding both faces using a palm sander, starting with 80 grit, moving on to 120 grit, and then 150 or 220 grit. This is going to clean up both the faces of our workpiece. After sanding the faces, we can clamp our board in the vise, and we'll be taking just a little bit of 120 sandpaper and lightly going over the edges. After the edges have been cleaned up, we're going to take 80 grit sandpaper and we're going to break the corners. We're just creating a little microscopic radius. And then we'll come back with 120 and smooth it down. Now, during this sanding process, we do not want to sand the end, and we do not want to sand any of the corners or the edges on either of the ends. Later on in the project, when we assemble this together, we want the end to fit nice and tight up against the side, so we do not want these sanded. Do not sand the ends. And after our final sanding, our lower lateral connector is looking pretty good. If we take a look at our drop leaf end table project, the leaves are supported by our leaf supports located underneath the top. If we look at the schematic for our leaf support, we have a total width of 7 5/8 inches by a total length of 16 inches. Now, due to the shape of the leaf, we can orient both of these leaves, because we need 2 of them, in such a way that we can reduce the amount of waste by fitting them both onto a board that is 7 5/8 by 22. I have selected a board that is 8 1/2 inches wide. This is well over my 7 5/8 inches wide measurement. However, if I were to use this board as it is and cut both of my leaf support pieces, there is a chance that over the life of the project, these leaf support pieces might cup or bow or twist. Because my original board width is pretty wide. Anytime you are working with a wide piece of lumber, the lumber has a tendency to try and flatten out the growth rings. So on this piece of lumber, our growth rings are oriented in a downward position. Those growth rings will want to try to flatten out, causing a cup in the board. To prevent this from happening, we will be cutting the board in half, flipping half so the end grain is alternating, and then glue it back together. Given that this board is about 8 1/2 inches wide, this will give us plenty of material to clean up the edges, rip it down, glue it back together, and still have more than our 7 5/8 inch required width for our leaf support pieces. Taking a look at our schematic, we can see that a length of 22 inches will allow us to get both leaf support pieces out of this size board. Because we will be ripping our board in half and gluing it back together, I'm going to be cutting an oversized measurement of 22 1/2 inches. After squaring up my end by taking just a little bit of material off, I can mark my board at 22 1/2, which is our oversized measurement, and make that cut. And what I'm left with is one board that is a length of 22 1/2 inches by a width of 8 1/2 inches. Taking a look at the board that I will be getting both of my leaf supports out of, I have one straight lined edge that is pretty good, and I have one rough edge. I need to clean up the straight lined edge on the joiner by making 1 or 2 passes. This will then allow me to rip my board in half on the table saw by giving me one good, clean, jointed edge to place up against the fence on the table saw. And after ripping my board in half, I am left with my one good, clean, jointed edge that is up against the fence. I then have two mill-marked edges, which were the edges that touched the table saw blade. And I also have my one rough edge. I need to joint both of my mill-marked table saw edges to clean those up. That then leaves me with three good jointed edges. One of my pieces is done, and my other piece I need to clean up my rough edge on the table saw. Having that good jointed edge up against the fence. Again, taking off as little as possible so we have the maximum amount of material to work with. And then lastly, taking that mill-marked table sawed edge and cleaning that up on the joiner. My boards now have four good, clean, jointed edges. If I squeeze them together and measure my boards, I have 8 inches, which is more than enough of material to get my 7 5/8 inch pieces out of. I have previously cut down my big wide board, ripped it in half, and jointed the edges. This will yield me a couple pieces of lumber to work with that is cut to an oversized length, and I have an oversized width. I'm going to be focusing on both the face grain and the end grain. With my boards together, I can see the growth ring pattern. Because I separated the board, I want to flip one of the boards. So currently, both of the boards have the growth rings oriented upward. We're going to flip that so they are alternating. And then we're going to lay out the face grain to make it look like our glue joint does not exist. So if I take a look here, this looks pretty normal down here. So that looks pretty good. But when we get up to the top of the board, we have kind of straight grain almost, and this kind of round area. So I'm going to mix and match the boards and rotate them and turn them until I get some type of orientation that looks good. And when I get that about as good as I can, I'll double check the end grain, double check the face grain, and identify my joints. With 2 clamps spaced apart, I can lay out my boards in the orientation that I set them up, double checking that my number 1 identification mark is lined up. And I can then flip up my board, apply a good amount of glue, and spread that around so I have even coverage. I can then flip that board down and snug my clamps, double checking my ends and the face of my board, applying just a little bit of pressure to each clamp, and then coming back on top with a 3rd clamp. I can then move through and gently snug each of the clamps, double checking my end and face, and cleaning up any glue that squeezed out on the front and the back. And we need to let that sit for 24 hours. After having let our leaf support workpiece sit for 24 hours, the glue has fully cured and we can remove the clamps. If there is any residual glue on our workpiece, we want to clean that up with a glue scraper. And lastly, we just want to double check and make sure that it glued up correctly and there are no issues with it. Taking a look at the schematic, we can see that each leaf support has a total length of 16 inches and a total width of 7 5/8 inches. On the board that we glued up, we should be able to get 2 of these leaf supports. Now, although we had previously jointed the edges, we did have these boards in the clamps, so there is a good chance that the clamps have marred the edges of the lumber. So we're going to run one edge one time through the joiner to clean up that edge. That will give us a good, clean, jointed edge to put up against the fence on the table saw. Now the finished width is 7 5/8, but I want to add an additional 1/16 of an inch. So I will be setting this at 7 11/16. Because after I run this through the table saw, I will have a mill marked edge that I need to clean up. And then joiner that mill marked edge. And after cleaning up that edge, we have a board that is 7 5/8 by 22.5 inches long with a thickness of 1 inch. Taking a look at the schematic of our leaf support, we already have cut this to a width of 7 5/8. We now need to cut our workpiece to a length of 22 inches. Now the purpose of making this longer board is to get 2 leaf supports out of one board and minimize the amount of waste. It is important that the ends of this board be perfectly perpendicular to the edges. We have previously cleaned up the edges on the joiner. We now need to clean up the ends of the board so we can lay out that leaf support. It is essential that the adjacent edges of the leaf support be perfectly perpendicular. Now, although the schematic does say this board needs to be 22 inches long, if I'm a little bit longer, that's fine. As long as both ends of the board are cleaned up and perfectly perpendicular to the edge. And after cleaning up both of those ends, my board is a little bit over 22 1/4 inches, which is fine because as we look at the schematic, that middle area becomes waste material. Our leaf support board is currently 1 inch thick. If we take a look at the schematic, that leaf support needs to be 3/4 of an inch thick. Using the thickness planer, I can clean up the face of the board to make it look really nice. I'm also bringing down the thickness of the board a little bit at a time and by alternating sides, I can make sure that both faces get cleaned up and my thickness measurement gets brought down to 3/4 of an inch. It is important though to measure the board after each pass. And after finishing up on the planer, my board measures a little bit over 22 inches long by 7 5/8 inches wide by my thickness of 3/4 of an inch, which is my finished thickness. If I take a look at my schematic, I can see that I have an irregular shape for the leaf support. I have laid out those measurements onto a template for which I'm going to use to trace onto my workpiece. And when laying this out, we want to make sure that we are flush right in the corner so we can make this perpendicular. On the bandsaw, we can begin by cutting apart our 2 leaf supports, and then we can go back and cut out our shape. It is probably wise to create some relief cuts to help with the process. And you want to make sure that you stay a 1/16 to an 1/8 inch away from your line so we can sand it down later. Taking a look at our schematic, we have both interior curves and exterior curves. We can use the spindle sander to get all interior curves, and we can then use the belt sander or disc sander to help us with the exterior curves. And when finished, we should be left with 2 identical pieces. If we take a look at the plan of our project, we have 2 top leaf pieces. Those are held up by our leaf support pieces. The leaf support pieces need to be able to swing so we can put those leaves down. If we take a look at our leaf support schematic, we can see that there are 2 dowel hole locations for this pivot point. We need to lay out and drill this dowel pivot hole. We can see that it is located 3/8 of an inch in from the edge of our part, and it is also centered. Measuring 3/8 of an inch in at the top and towards the bottom. I can then use a straight edge to identify my drill location. I can then clamp my support in the vise, and I can see that 3/8 inch mark on the face of my board. Now, prior to drilling, I need to get a drill guide and a 3/8 inch drill bit. By inserting the drill bit into the drill guide, I can determine how far I'm going to drill. According to the schematics, we only want to drill 3/4 of an inch deep. So using a ruler, I'm going to set the depth to 3/4 of an inch, and I'm going to wrap a piece of tape around the shank of the bit so I know when to stop drilling. I'm then going to install my drill guide and line up my 3/8 inch drill location with my mark. I can then drill my first hole. This puts that hole 3/8 of an inch in from the edge. And the process is the same for the top of our other leaf support. One thing that you don't want to do is have the drill guide hanging way off of your part, because then it has a tendency to drop or tip down and you can drill a crooked hole that way. So you need to make sure that you are drawing your line on the side that correlates with the markings on the drill guide. That'll give us plenty of material for that drill guide to hang on to. One of the challenges with the bottom edge of our leaf support is there's not much material for our drill guide to hang on to. So it makes it very difficult to drill a perfectly parallel hole to the edge of our board. To remedy this, I'm going to add my second leaf support right next to it to give me a large surface to hang on to. This will then give me more than enough surface area to help keep that drill guide straight. Line up our next mark and continue with our drilling process. And that process can be followed for the last hole location. And at this point, our hole locations have all been drilled to the correct depth and location. If we take a look at the schematics for our leaf supports, we can see that the back edge right outside where we just drilled those holes is rounded. We need to add this radius to the back edge. And when we do this, we only want to do that back edge. We do not want any of the other edges to have that radius. Using a router table with a 3/8 inch bit set up with a fence, we can create the radius on that back edge. And with that radius on there, it's looking pretty nice. Having gone through all of the equipment, our leaf support pieces are looking good. We need to do a final sanding on these leaf support pieces. We're going to begin with an 80 grit sandpaper and sand both faces using the palm sander. We're then going to switch to a 120 grit. After that, we'll use either 150 or 220 grit sandpaper. When you are sanding the radius on the outside edge, you want to do this by hand. And when we are sanding the rest of the edges, we want to put a little microscopic round over. So we're going to be breaking the edge with a little bit of 80 grit sandpaper first, just so it's not so sharp. Then we're going to come back with 120 and 150 or 220. If you feel all of the edges They should feel nice and smooth. There should be no sharp edges around the entire piece. If we take a look at our project, the top is composed of a center top portion and a leaf on either side. If we take a look at our schematics, the top center is 9 inches wide by 23.5 inches long. Each of our top leaf pieces measure 8 inches wide by 23.5 inches long. If we take a look at our overall project plan again, we can see that the length of the top is 23.5 because that number is the same on our leaf schematic as well as our top center schematic, but the overall width is 25 inches. We're going to be gluing up a big board that we can get all 3 of these pieces out of. This means that it will need to be a bit more than 25 inches. So if we have this at least 26 inches, that should give us enough material to work with. Now, because this is the top of the project, which everyone is going to see, we want to choose the best looking lumber because everybody's going to see it. One of the things that I pay close attention to is the edges of the board, because this is the part that's going to be glued to another board. So I've selected these pieces of lumber that have fairly straight grain on the edges because I know that I can line up the straight grain with the straight grain pretty easily. Additionally, each of these boards is about 6 inches wide, just a little bit over. Because I need a final piece glued up that is more than 25 inches, I can cut 5 of these 6-inch pieces and have that equal more than 25 inches. Additionally, that grain should be able to line up pretty easily. Taking a look at my top, center, and leaf schematics, my total length is 23.5 inches. I want to give myself just a little bit extra material, so I will be cutting my pieces at 24 inches to give myself an extra ½ inch. Start by squaring up the end by taking as little off as possible. Measure your 24 inches, cut your first piece, and then continue that process. Measure, mark, cut. Measure, mark, cut for the remaining pieces until we have our 5 pieces. In total, I have 32 inches of material, which is more than enough for me to make the top and the top leaves. I have previously cut 5 boards, each board measuring 24 inches long. Together they equal 32 inches. This 32-inch measurement is more than my 25-inch measurement that I need to make my top. I'm going to be gluing all of these boards together, but need to prep the edges first. Each of these boards has one straight-lined edge, which is pretty good, and one rough edge. I'm going to run the straight-lined edge once or twice through the joiner just to clean it up. This will give me a good clean edge to go up against the fence on the table saw and removing as little as possible on the table saw. I want to clean up that rough edge. This will leave me with the maximum amount of material to work with to get my top out of. And after using the table saw to clean up that rough edge, I'm going to run each of those now mill marked edges through the joiner. So I will finish with 2 good, clean, jointed edges. And after cleaning up all of those edges, I have a total width of 29 inches, which will give me more than enough material for making my top. That is a total of 25 inches. After having squared up all of my edges and double checking that all of the seams are nice and tight, I'm ready to lay out for glue. I'm first going to mark the orientation of the grain pattern on the end grain, either up or down. This one's going down, 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 up. And by flipping some of these boards, I can make sure I have my alternating pattern of up, down, up, down, up. And then I'm going to go through and line up my face grain as best as I can, keeping in mind that my end grain still needs to be alternating. And once satisfied, we can number all of our glue joints. On the glue table with a couple clamps spread apart, I'm going to lay out my boards in the same orientation that I had previously laid them out on the table. Next, I can flip each of those boards up and apply a fair amount of glue and spread that glue around so we have good coverage on the edge of every board. Flip those boards down. Line up our ends. Gently snug the clamps while checking to make sure our surface is flush and our ends haven't shifted on us. And we'll add a third clamp on top. And snug that one down. And then we'll go through and snug down each of those clamps. And lastly, wipe the glue. That then will be set aside for 24 hours. After 24 hours, our glue has fully cured and we can remove our clamps from our top. And we can hang those clamps back up. If I take a close look at the top, I want to double check and make sure that everything glued up as it should, that there are no gaps or areas where it is not relatively flush. Additionally, areas that there might be some extra glue, perhaps underneath where the clamp was sitting, we need to take a glue scraper and scrape off as much glue as we can. If I take a look at the schematic of my project, the entire top is 23.5 inches long. The boards that I have glued up currently are 24 inches long. And given that all three of the top pieces need to be exactly the same measurement so everything lines up, we will be cross-cutting our entire top piece using the panel saw. By placing the edge of my board on the rollers, I'm able to perform a cross-cut procedure that is perpendicular to the edge of my board. My first cut is set up to remove as little as possible so we can get one square edge. I can then mark my board at 23.5 and cross-cut my top to that mark. And what I am left with is my top that is sized to a length of exactly 23.5 inches. Width-wise, I'm still sitting at 29 inches, which is more than enough material to work with. If I take a look at my project plans, the top is comprised of 3 pieces, 1 top center and 2 top leaf pieces. On the board that I've been working on, I want to get each of these 3 pieces out of that board. And when I glued this together, I made sure that the grain pattern matched up as best as I could. Because of this, once I cut my 3 pieces, I don't want to mess up the grain pattern. So I'm going to take some chalk and I'm going to draw the top on my workpiece, just as a visual reference. And it doesn't have to be perfect, it just needs to give me a visual idea as I'm cutting my pieces to make sure I don't mix them up in these first stages. Now, although I have 2 good jointed edges, I did just glue this top up and the clamp was sitting on the edge. So there's a good chance that my edge has been marred by the clamp. I'm going to run the edge one time through the joiner before moving on to the table saw. Now if I take a look at my project piece, my chalk line indicates that the first piece I will be cutting is the leaf. If I look at the schematic tells me that my first rip cut will be 8 inches wide. So this will then yield me that 8-inch wide top leaf. However, when I run this through the table saw, I will be left with a mill marked edge. So I'm going to set the table saw to 8 1/16 inches, which will give me a little bit extra material to joint off. And with my good, clean, jointed edge up against the fence, I can make my cut. What I am left with is my first leaf with a good, clean, jointed edge and a mill-marked edge. I am also left with my workpiece that has a mill-marked edge and a clamp marred edge. Before I continue, I'm going to run both of my mill-marked edges through the joiner to clean those up. Taking a look at my remaining piece, my top center gets cut next, and taking a look at the schematic, my top center is 9 inches wide. I'm going to be setting the fence to 9 1/16, which will give me an additional 1/16 to joint off. And with my good, clean, jointed edge up against the fence, I can make my cut. What I am left with is my top center piece that has one good, clean, jointed edge and 1 mill marked edge from the table saw. I also have my remaining workpiece with 1 table sawed edge and 1 clamp marred edge. Before I continue, I'm going to clean up both of the mill marked edges on the joiner. The last piece to be cut then is my additional top leaf piece. The schematic again shows that this piece is 8 inches wide, so I will be setting the table saw to 8 1/16 and completing my cut. And again, what I am left with is 1 good, clean, jointed edge and 1 mill marked edge, for which I need to use the jointer to clean up my last mill marked edge. If I line up all of my boards back in the original order, I can see that my chalk lines line up as well as my glue joint numbering. And all of the seams turned out pretty well also. I have 3 pieces for my top. I have 2 of my leaf pieces and my top center. The 2 leaf pieces are 8 inches wide. My top center is 9 inches wide. Just so I don't get these pieces mixed up down the road, I'm going to label the end grain so I know the orientation of all of my 3 pieces. Top center, I have a left leaf and a right leaf. If we take a look at the schematic, the thickness of our top pieces is 3/4 of an inch. Now that we have laid out all of our top pieces and put some identifying marks to help us keep this same orientation, we can plane our top pieces. Now it is highly critical that once the planer has been set, all 3 pieces for your top are run through at that same setting. This will ensure that the thickness of every piece of the top is identical. That is most critical for every single piece to be identically the same thickness. Now, according to the schematics, the finished thickness is 3/4 of an inch. However, the top of your project is what gets all the wear and tear. So I'm going to leave the top a little bit thicker. I'm only going to plane enough material off until both surfaces are clean. And after planing, I am left at about 13/16 of an inch thick. So this will give me just a little bit extra material and make that top just a little bit stronger. And if I line up my end grain markings on my boards, I'm looking pretty good. Taking a look at the schematic for my top leaf, I can see that the corners are cut away. There's a little design there. With my top pieces laid out in the orientation that they will be going, I'm using a template to trace this feature in each of the corners. On the bandsaw, I'm going to create a few relief cuts before cutting out this feature. Now I want to make sure I stay a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch away from the line so we can sand down to the line when we're done. And after spindle sanding, they're looking pretty good. With our top cut down to size and the corners shaped, we are ready to finish sand the top. To do this, we will be starting with 80 grit sandpaper. We're going to sand both surfaces, the top of the top and the bottom of the top. We're then going to go to 120 grit sandpaper. And then we're going to finish it up with a finer grit, possibly a 150 or 220 grit sandpaper. Now, during this sanding process, it is very important that you do not sand the edges. The edges are perfect because we ran them through the joiner. When you start sanding the edges, all of a sudden your boards don't line up anymore. Only sand the faces. And once finished, our top pieces are looking pretty good. On our project, the cleat will be used to help secure the top to the base of the project. Taking a look at the schematics, our cleat piece is 6.5 inches long by 3/4 inches wide by 3/4 inches thick. Because we are working with a relatively small piece of material, we want to select a larger, longer piece of material that we can get both of these cleat pieces out of. This will allow us to work a little bit safer on the equipment with these smaller pieces. I have selected this piece, which measures about 21 inches long by 1.25 inches by 1 inch. This should yield me plenty of material to get both of these cleat pieces. Now, as noted by the schematic, when looking at the piece from the end, it is a square, 3/4 inch by 3/4 inch. On the planer, I'm going to start by running the board the long way, this meaning width side up. So essentially I am planing the edge of the board, not the face. I'm going to do this a couple times, bringing down the planer with each pass until my board is about square as I look at it from the end. So after having run that through multiple times only on the edge of the board, when I take a look at the end of the board, it is looking just about square. Now when I measure this, I'm at about 15/16 each way. I want to bring this down to 3/4 inch. So this time I'm going to close the mouth of the planer a half a turn. I'm going to run my board through on edge, and then without changing the planer, I'm going to rotate my board 90 degrees so I can then plane the face. This will ensure that I am planing this square down to a smaller square. And with each pass, I'm going to measure my board so I don't go under 3/4 inch. We'll continue the same process until we get down to 3/4 inch by 3/4 inch. After planing, I am sitting right at 3/4 inch by 3/4 inch. If we take a look back at our schematic, we know that the finished length of our cleat is 6.5 inches. However, we have a 67.5 degree angle on either end of our cleat. On our miter saw, we want to set the table to 22.5 degrees. 22.5 plus 67.5 equals 90. So this 22.5 degree angle is the same as a 67.5 degree angle. And since we selected a piece that was longer than what we needed, this will give us plenty of material to hang on to safely. Once set up, I'm going to cut off just a little tiny bit at my 22.5 degree angle. Taking a look at the schematic, our piece is a trapezoid. So we need to cut a trapezoid on the miter saw. With my first cut completed, I need to create an additional cut at the opposite angle. Right now I have one side of my trapezoid. If I were to just slide this material down and create a second cut, I would be creating a parallelogram. However, what I can do is rotate my material 180 degrees, and this will now create an opposite angle, giving me my trapezoid. And after having flipped my material, I can measure 6.5 inches from point to point. So I will be cutting this at an angle. From point to point will be 6.5 inches. Now what I'm left with is my remaining material that has one end already cut to 22.5 degrees. I can rotate that 180 degrees, measure my 6.5 inches from point to point, and make my cut. With our pieces sized down correctly and cut with our angles, we are ready to lay out for our holes. Taking a look at the schematic, we have a countersink hole that has a diameter of 3/8 of an inch. This has a flat bottom. This countersink will accommodate the screw head. We also have a 1/8 inch diameter hole that is drilled through the entire piece. Now if we take a look at the isometric drawings, our larger countersunk hole is on the lower portion of the slant. The top portion of the slant, which was 6.5 inches when we measured it on the miter saw, does not have this larger countersunk drill. It just has that diameter of 1/8 inch hole. Taking a look at our measurements, if we lay out our countersink hole first on the lower end of our trapezoid, we can see that we are in 3/4 of an inch from our slant or our cut line, and we are centered. Three-fourths inch in from the edge, 3/8 inch in from the sides. And with a little tape on a Forstner bit, I can ensure that I will not drill too deep. After our countersunk holes have been drilled, we can utilize the small divot in the center from the spike on the Forstner bit to help with the drilling process using our 1/8 inch diameter drill bit. And that 1/8 inch bit will be drilled all the way through our part. And lastly, if any of those holes need a little cleaned up with sandpaper, we can hit that real lightly. Before we begin the assembly process, we need to double check all of our parts to make sure that we have all of the parts, but also to make sure that all of the parts have been prepped. Starting with our side pieces, we need to make sure that the holes have been drilled and our finish sanding has been done. We should have 2 feet pieces cut to size, shape, and the finish sanding completed. We should have 1 lower lateral connector cut to size, finish sanded, and all of our pilot holes drilled both in the ends as well as on one edge to accommodate our leaf supports. Next, we have our leaf supports cut to size, sanded, holes in the ends drilled to accommodate that pivot point, and the back edge routed. We then have our top, which is composed of our top center and a leaf on either side of that center. The faces should be finish sanded, but the edges should still be sharp. And lastly, we should have our cleat pieces, 2 of those, cut to size, drilled, and finish sanded. The first step in the assembly process is to attach the feet to the side pieces. We need to pay very close attention that the foot is installed on the face that has our larger counterbore 3/8 inch diameter drill locations. Do not attach it to the side with just the 1/8 inch hole. We next need to make sure that our foot piece is perfectly flush with the bottom of our side piece. You do not want that sitting crooked. You do not want that sitting too high or too low. It needs to be perfectly flush. And the next thing we're going to look for is to make sure that we are sitting centered. The length measurement at the top of the foot is 8 inches. The width of the side is 8 inches. When installing the foot, it should be flush with our side piece. Now additionally, we do not want to put too much glue where the glue is going to squeeze out at the connection point between the side and the foot. If necessary, you can draw some boundary markers for the location of the glue to help prevent any glue from squeezing out. So if I go 1 inch in from the sides and the top, that can help me not get carried away with the glue. So as long as I stay inside the rectangle with my glue, I should not have an issue with glue squeezing out unless I use way too much glue. Next, we can spread the glue. You want to get good coverage, but again, you don't want to overdo it with the glue where it's going to squeeze out all over the place. Double check that our holes are positioned correctly. Going to double check that the bottom is nice and flush and we are centered left and right. And then adding some clamps will help secure that. However, when you clamp it, make sure that it doesn't shift around on you. Flush with the bottom, even left and right. I'm on my side with the larger holes. and I have no glue squeezing out. This then needs to sit for 24 hours. And after 24 hours, we can remove those clamps. And those sides with the feet attached are looking pretty nice. If we take a look at our project plans, we have a lower lateral connector that is connected to our side pieces. Now, if you recall, we did a few different drilling operations, both in our side pieces, as well as drilling one pilot hole in our lower lateral connector. Using 1 1/4 inch screws, we're going to start the screw in the top hole on our side piece, and we're only going to install the screw until about 1/8 inch comes through the other side. Then we're going to line up our lower lateral connector with the location that screw is coming out and hold that in place while we install the screw the rest of the way. And we'll follow that procedure for the other side as well. Now, once the top screw on both sides have been installed, we're going to gently lock down the screws with an impact driver. At this point, our project is starting to come together. We're looking pretty good. Our lower lateral connector is only connected by 1 screw, which allows us to pivot this piece around. Now, we want this lower lateral connector to be perpendicular with the base, so we can use a square to make sure that we are perfect. If we are not perfectly square, we can always rotate this lower lateral connector. We then want to bring our project back to the table saw, as the cast iron top on the table saw is the only perfectly flat area in the shop. And the objective is we want to check the project for teeter. If we're really crooked, our project is going to rock back and forth. Given that we only have 1 screw installed, we can twist our project back and forth until there is no teeter. And with that lower lateral connector perpendicular to the bottom of the project and no teeter from the sides, we can drill our second hole location on both sides of our project. And with those pilot holes drilled, we can install our second screw. And gently lock that down with the impact driver. The base of our project is coming together. The next thing we need to do is attach the cleat pieces to the side pieces. The cleats will be going on the inside of the project at the very top. Our countersunk larger hole will be facing down, and that small little pilot hole will be facing up. Gluing this works best when the project is laying on its side, and we're going to begin by adding a little bit of glue, flipping that over to make sure that the larger countersink hole is facing down. Our smaller pilot holes are facing up. We want to center this left and right, and then add a couple clamps. Now, it is essential that the top edge be perfectly flush. And lastly, wipe the glue. These clamps will need to remain on the project for at least 24 hours. And after 24 hours, we can then remove those clamps. With the base of our project assembled, we can now begin the installation process for the leaf supports. If I take one of my leaf supports and set it upside down on that lower lateral connector, I can see that it almost extends the entire height to the top of my project. I am left with about 3/8 of an inch spacing between where that leaf support ends and where the top of my project is going to go. If we split the difference, this will allow clearance for that leaf support to pivot without hitting anything. If I take a look at my leaf support schematic, I can see that we drilled our dowel pivot location hole to a depth of 3/4 of an inch. If I look at my lower lateral connector schematic, we also drilled that dowel hole pivot location to a depth of 3/4 of an inch. If I add my 3/4 of an inch measurement for my lower lateral connector to my 3/4 of an inch measurement to my leaf support, as well as adding half the distance of my clearance from my leaf support to the top of my project, I get a measurement of about 1 11/16 of an inch. I'm going to be using 11/32 dowel, which is just under our 3/8 of an inch drill hole measurement. And I'm going to be cutting it just a little bit longer than I need, just in case maybe I drilled my hole a little bit deeper than I should have, or I didn't quite do my math just quite right. So I'm going to cut this to 2 inches, and we're going to test it out. We can then install that dowel and our leaf support. If I measure my clearance, I have 3/8 of an inch clearance. But if you remember, when we laid this out previously and we had that wing support tight up against our lateral connector, we only had about 3/8 of an inch to begin with. We actually had just a little bit less. I need to make sure that I am very precise when I calculate this out. I'm going to switch over to my 1/16 side of the ruler, and I can see that I have 5/16 of an inch. I want half of this measurement to be on the bottom and half of this measurement to be on the top. So when I reinstall my components together, the distance from the leaf support to my lower lateral connector needs to be 5/32 of an inch. I have determined that I need to remove 7/32 of an inch from my dowel, and I'm going to use the disc sander to do that. Now when I install my components, I have the clearance that I'm looking for. And taking a look at the top, that looks good as well. I will need to do this same procedure for the other leaf support. And with that second one sized down and installed, we're looking really good. With our lower dowels installed, our leaf supports are a little wobbly, but they rotate in there nicely. We have plenty of clearance for the top. We need to figure out where to drill the holes in the top so that all of this lines up. If we set the top on and take a step back, we know that we want our leaf support gap to be the same throughout the length of the leaf support. What we don't want is the center portion to be getting smaller or wider. We want these leaf support pieces to be perfectly parallel to each other. Now, if we remove those leaf supports and the dowels, and we measure the distance between the center point of each of the dowels, we know that these dowels are exactly 1.5 inches apart from each other. We also know that our top is going to be exactly centered on our project. We are not going to want our top to one side or the other. We also are going to have it centered widthwise. And with that information in mind, I'm going to lay out my top pieces, double checking that my marks on the end grain line up so I know that this is the way that the top needs to be positioned. And before continuing, I need to make a decision if what I see is going to be the top of the top or the bottom of the top. So I'm going to take a good look at the grain to see if I like the way it looks. I'm then going to flip all of these boards and take a look at the grain again to see if I would prefer this to be the top of the top. And whichever side you choose to be the bottom, we need to identify that in pencil. Now this side that we have marked bottom is the side that we will be drilling on for our dowel pivot points. We do not need our leaf pieces, so we can remove those. We are left with our top center that is labeled bottom, meaning this is the bottom of the top. My top center piece has a width of 9 inches, so I'm going to identify my halfway mark at 4.5 inches. And I will identify that mark towards the lower portion as well. And using a straight edge, I can connect those marks. Next, we need to find the center point lengthwise. We have a total of 23.5 inches of length. Half of 23.5 is 11 3/4. So I'm going to put a mark towards the lower portion and a mark towards the upper portion. And connect those points in the center. So what I have done is identify the exact center point of this board. To verify that I have indeed located the center, I can take my straight edge from corner to corner, put a mark, and from corner to corner, the other direction, and put a mark. And I can see that I have, in fact, found the exact center point. Now, if you recall, the holes that we drilled for the dowels are exactly 1.5 inches apart. Placing our ruler right on the center point and lined up with our center line, we can make marks 3/4 of an inch on either side of that center mark. That then becomes our drill location. After having located our drill locations for the upper holes to accommodate our dowel pivot point, we are ready to drill. We will be drilling with a 3/8 inch Forstner bit, and we only want to go halfway through the top. The distance from the tip of the Forstner bit to the shoulder is right at about 3/8 of an inch long. When we drill this, we are going to be drilling to the point where we reach that shoulder, and then we're going to stop. Do not drill all the way through the top. Clamping your workpiece will allow you to have both hands on the drill so you don't drill through your hand. Now that we have set up our hole locations, we need to do a little bit of math to figure out the length of dowel pin. Taking a look at the schematic for our leaf support, we drilled a dowel hole location 3/8 of an inch in diameter to a depth of 3/4 of an inch. On our top, we drilled the hole to a depth of 3/8 of an inch. And we have a top clearance of about 5 or 6 30-seconds. This gives us a total dowel length of about 1 5/16. Now, in case I drilled one of these holes a little bit deeper than I should have, or I did my math wrong, I'm going to measure the dowel to 1.5 inches. Now I will be cutting 2 pieces using 11 30-seconds dowel, each being cut to a length of 1.5 inches. I can then test those dowels out by installing them in my leaf support and then placing the top on and lining them up with the top. Now I can clearly see that I am bottoming out on those dowels. Obviously those dowels are too long. I'm going to bring the dowels down just a little bit and test them out and see if I can get that top to sit squarely on the base. And after a couple times back and forth to the sander, the dowel fits good and the top fits good. It is not bottoming out. My leaf supports swing freely and my joint is looking very tight where my top connects to the side and my cleat. Now before I continue, I'm going to sand off all of my pencil marks from the bottom side of the top. With the top fitting properly and our leaf supports working, we are ready to attach the top to the base. Flipping the project upside down, which will allow us to lay out the base lengthwise and widthwise. Using a ruler, we want the distance on the right side to be equal to the distance on the left side. Additionally, since our lower lateral connector is 18 inches long and we want our sides perfectly parallel to each other, by adding a couple 18-inch spacers, these are just pieces of waste material, one on either side of my project, I can ensure that when I'm laying this out, my sides remain perfectly parallel to each other. And I end up being right at about 2 1/32 of an inch on either side. So I'm going to put a little pencil mark. Then I also want to check width-wise to make sure that I'm centered as well. This ended up being exactly a 1/2 an inch. And when we have that lined up, we're going to mark that with a pencil also. And with everything laid out and marked, I can remove those temporary spacer boards. To glue, we're going to remove the base from the top, apply glue to the top edge of our project, both on the side and the cleat. We want to spread that around and get good coverage. Then we want to flip the project back over and line all of our dowels up. Next, we want to line up our pencil marks and install a clamp on each side. And after double checking to make sure that everything is perfect, we will install a screw right next to the clamps. And we want to make sure we are only installing that until it is snug. We do not want to screw it too tight and go through the top of our project. Then we'll remove the clamps, rotate the project, make sure our pencil marks are lined up again, reclamp it, and install 2 more screws. Remove the clamps and wipe the glue extremely well. Once finished, we can flip it back over and double check to make sure everything looks good. With the top connected to the base, we can now take a look at attaching each leaf to the top. We'll begin by flipping the project upside down and adding our leaf pieces. And I'm also checking that all of my markings are lined up, meaning each of the piece is in the proper location. Now, before I attach anything or lay anything out, I want to make sure that I have a flush surface where my pieces come together. If there's any irregularities in your workbench, it might cause one of the pieces to move. So I'm going to apply a hand clamp to the seam so that I know my top surface is going to be flush. I also need to check and make sure that my end is perfectly flush. I'm also going to add a bar clamp and very gently snug that down. I want very, very little pressure, just enough to help keep that seam tight. And then I'm going to add a second bar clamp on the other side. Again, applying just a little bit of light pressure just to snug those pieces together. So taking a look at how this is set up, I am on the corner of the table. I installed 2 hand clamps, 1 on each of the seams, and 2 bar clamps with just a tiny bit of pressure just to hold my pieces together. Next, I need to determine where the hinge is going to go. Running down the exact center of the hinge, we have a pin. That pin needs to run exactly down our seam where the top centerpiece meets the top leaf. The problem is, if you did a good job laying out the top, gluing it, cutting it, and keeping everything lined up, it's near impossible to see that seam. If I gently loosen up my clamps, I can see that seam starting to appear. To help me line everything up, I'm going to draw a pencil line right down that seam and then tighten up my clamps. Now when I go to lay out my hinge, it is very easy to line up that center pin with my seam. It is vital that the hinge pin be lined up with the seam. I'm also going to space this out 3/4 of an inch so that it is in line with the edge of my cleat. And with that hinge positioned correctly, I'm going to take a scratch-awl or a screw and put a small divot right in the center of one of the hole locations. And using a 3/32 drill bit, I need to drill down the length of the threads, but not any further. So I will be applying a little piece of tape to this drill bit so I know when to stop. Do not drill all the way through your project. And then we're going to come back and install that screw. And at this stage, we are only going to install 4 of the screws. This will leave us 2 additional screws just in case we need to adjust something later. Now, after the first 2 hinges are installed with 4 screws, we need to rotate our project. And leaving the bar clamps on, I'm very carefully going to rotate the project. And this will allow us to repeat the same process to the other side. And after we have all 4 hinges installed with 4 screws on each hinge, we can remove the clamps and flip the project over to see how it looks. If everything functions as it should, and no adjustments are needed, we can install those last screws. At this point, our project is looking really good. Each leaf for the top functions properly as it should. And our leaf support pieces slide out underneath that. Now when we bring each of those leaves up and we slide those leaf support pieces underneath, our top sits crooked. Because if you recall, those leaf supports are just slightly below the height of the top. So we're going to flip the project over and we're going to create some wedges, or basically like little door stops that our leaf support pieces will ride on, providing a little bit of pressure pushing that top up. On the table saw, I'm going to cut some waste material to a width of 1.5 inches. I'm then going to plane that piece down to 1/2 inch. Now my 1/2 inch piece of material is significantly larger than my gap. So using the belt sander, we want to sand down our material and create a very shallow wedge. And then we can test out that wedge to see if it'll work. It should slide up the wedge and get stuck. Now, if you have too steep of a wedge, it's just going to fall right off. We want a very shallow wedge. We can then cut that wedge on the bandsaw. Now, when we attach our wedge, we're going to be placing a little bit of glue on the bottom surface We're going to place that on our leaf. We're going to swing out our leaf support, and when we have good pressure, we want that leaf support to be perfectly parallel with the ends of the table. What we don't want is the leaf to be crooked one way or another. We want it to be parallel to the ends of the tabletop. We also don't want that so far in that we're sitting on top of our seam where that leaf is going to close. And then we're going to wipe the glue and leave it in this position for 24 hours. And one additional thing that we want to double check is that our wedge is positioned correctly so that when we open both of these wings, they sit nice and flat. With all of our components installed, our project is looking pretty good. However, if we take a look at the top, we are left with a very sharp edge. We're going to be using a portable router to create a profile and give our top some character. And when finished, we have a nice looking profile on that top edge. If we take a close look at the top edge of our project where we just routered, we have a very sharp edge. We also have a few light burn marks from the router, as well as our pencil marks that we used to help line everything up earlier. Along the sides of our project, we also have very sharp edges. All of these sharp edges need addressed. On the top of my project, which I just routered, I want it to have the appearance that it is still square. Rather than beginning with 80 grit sandpaper, I'm going to begin with 120 grit sandpaper and do just a little bit of sanding just to make it not as sharp. It doesn't take much. With my burn marks and pencil marks, I'm going to begin with 80 grit and then move on to 120 grit. And then on all of my other sharp edges, I want to again start with an 80 grit and move on to a 120 grit. And then lastly, come back with either 150 or 220 grit sandpaper over the entire project. After we are finished sanding everything on the project, we want to install a couple of buttons in the hole locations for our fastener that holds in the lower lateral support. After having completed the entire build process on our project, we are now ready for stain. We are going to be using Minwax Golden Oak stain, some gloves, and a rag. I'm going to begin by placing some spacers on the table and flipping my project upside down onto those spacers. And I'm going to begin by staining the entire underside of my table first, working it into every corner on the project. Once the underside is looking pretty good, we can flip our project over and stain the top. The goal is to do an entire coat of stain, wait about 5 minutes, add another coat of stain, wait another 5 minutes, and then add a third coat of stain. And this should get us close to the color that we are wanting to achieve. We then need to wait 24 hours for that stain to dry. And don't forget to stain inside our edge here. After we have let that stain sit for 24 hours, our project is looking really good. To finish this project, we will be using Minwax fast drying polyurethane. This is a clear gloss oil-based polyurethane. To begin the finishing process, we need to flip our table back upside down, and much like we did with the stain, we're going to polyurethane the underside of the table first. Once we have applied one coat to the underside, we can flip our project. And apply a coat to our top surface. And with our first coat applied, we want to lower each leaf and get that top edge. After that, our project needs to sit for 24 hours. After sitting for 24 hours, our project is dry to the touch. However, it feels pretty rough. We will be using a worn out piece of 220 grit sandpaper or even 320 grit sandpaper and sand the entire surface of the project extremely lightly with virtually no pressure. This will remove the inconsistencies in the polyurethane finish, leaving us a nice smooth surface. And when finished sanding, we're going to flip our table upside down and proceed with our second coat of polyurethane. The second coat is going to go on just a little bit smoother since we already have one layer that has sealed the lumber. This also means that the second coat might drip or run just a little bit easier. So we're going to want to double check to make sure we don't have any drips and runs. After our second coat has dried for 24 hours, our project feels just a little bit rough still, but that surface is looking much better. We're going to again sand the entire project with a worn out piece of 220 grit sandpaper or even possibly a 320 grit sandpaper. We want to use extremely light pressure and sand the entire surface. Lastly, we can apply our third coat of polyurethane and let that third coat sit for an additional 24 hours.